again to our annual Lee Jackson Day Symposium here in Lexington, Virginia. Brandon Dorsey, commander of the Stonewall Brigade camp here, that we sponsor this event, have done so for the last 25 years. This is the 26th year for the event. We picked it up after the first year. We have a little history section on our website. I welcome you to go to LeeJacksonPark.com and look at our website there, and under there you'll see a Lee Jackson Day tab and some history on Lee Jackson Day. It's a good read. This event started originally in Virginia as a celebration of Robert E. Lee's birthday when Governor Fitzhugh Lee was in office back in the 1880s. Eventually Jackson's name was added to it, and this event in some form or another has happened in Lexington for years. Sometimes it was as small as a dinner, usually sponsored by the UDC or the Sons, or even in the early days of United Confederate Veterans, and usually had a wreath laying or lemon toss or something out at Jackson's grave. And of course, back in the day at the Lee Chapel, wreaths and things would be placed. There's been congressmen and other people that spoke at events here early on, so it's a good read. I'd encourage you to look at that. But our purpose here, we try to bring in some speakers every year to educate and promote the study of history, specifically following around Lee and Jackson. And our next speaker this afternoon is D. Jonathan White, who recently joined our camp after retiring back in the area, and we're glad to have him. Jonathan White is a Virginian whose family has been in the Old Dominion since 1623. He spent 25 years in the U.S. Army, mostly in Special Forces. In 2007, he walked the entire Jackson's Valley campaign of 387 miles in 35 days. And, yeah, kind of definitely an accomplishment. He holds 4 master's degrees and earned his PhD at the University of Alabama in 2017. He's taught at Virginia Tech, Radford University, Liberty University, and at Virginia Military Institute. And he currently lives here in the Shenandoah Valley. So I would like to welcome Jonathan White to the podium.
Well, what possessed me to walk Jackson's Valley campaign was to kind of see what it feels like to walk 387 miles. It hurts. What I would propose today is talk about Jackson's Valley campaign. A lot of folks have talked about it. I want to talk about what effect it had on Abraham Lincoln and his decision-making as Commander-in-Chief of the Union forces. The debate on the operations of Confederate General Stonewall Jackson in the Valley in 1862 have caused President Lincoln to panic as one that's been joined in relatively recent days in academic circles. The appropriate strategic response of political leaders to battlefield developments retains its importance. In this case, offers some insights into evaluating strategic responses. The origins of the assertion that Lincoln panicked during the distant past of Civil War historiography. William Allen, a former member of Jackson's staff and the author of the early history of the campaign, in 1879, Allen described, quote, the panic produced by Jackson's defeat of Banks at Winchester. In 1881, Confederate President Jefferson Davis described how Jackson caused indescribable panic in the cities of the northern states. British author and Jackson biographer Colonel G.F.R. Henderson wrote in 1898, in the cities of the North, the panic was indescribable. Even Northern authors contributed to this view. William Tenney, who wrote in 1866, wrote that, quote, the panic that Jackson's movements caused in the departments at Washington and the offices of the governors of the states. Union officer Alexander Webb in 1882 wrote of the sudden intelligence of Banks's reverses and the fact that Jackson was on the Potomac caused the wildest excitement in Washington. Given the less than objective nature of these, I mean, the participants, you can excuse them, they were participants. It's not surprising that more recent authors have challenged this view. Gary Gallagher at the University of Virginia, in a 2003 collection of essays on the Valley Campaign, wrote, quote, "Among the more durable misconceptions about Jackson's campaign is that Lincoln panicked in the wake of the battles of Front Royal and First Winchester. Gallagher says that Lincoln, quote, kept his head and used Jackson's success to coax McClellan into a more aggressive stance on the peninsula." I'm going to take issue with that interpretation. An examination of what panic is and how it affects war would seem to be in order. After reviewing the facts of Jackson's Valley campaign and President Lincoln's strategic choices in response to that campaign, a critical evaluation of Lincoln's decision-making is possible. A review of the case leads to the conclusion that Lincoln did in fact succumb to a form of panic, but neither in the way nor in the time that post-war authors held that it did. Defining panic, however, is a necessary preliminary. A traditional definition of panic is, quote, a sudden, overwhelming fear that produces hysterical or irrational behavior. Panic in northern cities or on the part of northern individuals, however, doesn't mean that President Lincoln shared that emotion, although the political pressures generated by that panic might well have influenced his military calculations. Further, Lincoln's emotional state, even if we could determine what it is, and I'm not one of those historians that wants to wrestle historical figures onto the psychoanalysis chair and get it out of him, I can say that we can look at the decisions he made as commander-in-chief. For this reason, the paper is going to focus on the strategic panic and its functional effect. Strategic panic in this sense means ceasing or diverting resources from operations that are strategically effective and commencing strategically ineffective operations because of unreasonable fear. The key issue is not the president's emotional state, but whether this translated into strategic decision-making. Were President Lincoln's decisions effective? To evaluate the effectiveness of the strategic choices that President Lincoln made, three criteria present themselves. First, did the choice represent an efficient use of military assets? Second, was the chosen course of action likely to succeed given the foreseeable difficulties? And finally, would the chosen course achieve the strategic goal in light of the accepted military thought of the day? An examination of the military thought of the day is necessary before we start, though. There were schools of military thought prevalent at the time characterized by a tension between ideals of distribution and concentration. Distribution was the creation of various geographical military departments and the distribution of forces among them. Both the Union and the Confederate governments created geographical military departments that distributed forces among them early in the war. The other ideal is that of concentration. Napoleon, who was cast an enormous shadow over the military thinking before the Civil War, he wrote, "When you have resolved to fight a battle, collect your whole force. Dispense with nothing. A single battalion sometimes decides the day." Napoleon's thoughts were translated to Civil War officers. Jackson, for example, was known to have carried a copy of Napoleon's maxims in his saddlebags. Baron Antoine-Henri Jomini, who was a Swiss officer who fought with Napoleon, wrote what is considered to be the standard text on strategy, and he wrote, this is a quote, "The fundamental principle of war is to operate with the greatest part of one's forces in a combined effort against the decisive point." Henry Halleck, who had read Jomini and internalized a lot of his ideas, wrote he wrote the standard English language text used by the U.S. Army. Halleck wrote to President Lincoln, quote, "Permit me to remark that we are operating upon too many points. Richmond and Corinth are now the great strategical points of the war, and our success at these points should be ensured at all hazards." I think he was right about that. Trying to do too much at once, not a good plan. The struggle between these ideas of distribution and concentration played out in the Virginia campaigns in the spring of '62. The main objective of Union forces in the Eastern Theater that spring was Richmond. Now remember, by April of 1862, the Confederates had lost New Orleans and Nashville. So two of the three biggest cities in the South had been lost to the Union forces. You lose Richmond, you get 3 out of 3, and then the impression starts to build that it's over. Capturing Richmond would force the evacuation of the Confederate government, and as well as seize considerable military industrial resources in the city. McClellan planned to land at Fort Monroe and advance up the peninsula. However, the railroads west of Washington had to be secured, and President Lincoln required that an adequate force be left in place to protect the capital. To this end, a Union force under General Nathaniel Banks seized Winchester in Virginia in March of 1862 and pushed Jackson's small force deep into the Shenandoah Valley, up the valley south, and away from the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Having thus secured Washington's rail lines of communication, McClellan deployed the main Union Army onto the peninsula in mid-March. On March 11th, however, Lincoln relieved McClellan of his role as general-in-chief of all Union armies and restricting his authority to the Department of the Potomac. Henceforward, the President and the Secretary of War in Washington would coordinate the operations in the various departments. Not a smart move. Not a good plan. The President, in the same war order, also created the Mountain Department in what is now West Virginia. John C. Fremont, who's the 1856 Republican candidate for president, was designated as the commander. He was ordered to open another offensive against Western Virginia with Knoxville, Tennessee, as the ultimate objective. Lincoln had a fascination with Knoxville. Being an alumnus of the University of Alabama, I don't see it. On April 4th, President Lincoln created 2 new departments out of McClellan's old Department of the Potomac, the Department of the Shenandoah under Banks and the Department of the Rappahannock under McDowell. These decisions would have far-reaching and unintended consequences as we'll see hereafter. Having neutralized the Confederate threat in the Shenandoah Valley, some of Banks's forces would secure the lower Shenandoah, and the rest of his forces would move east and replace McDowell's 40,000-man I Corps, First Corps, which was then protecting Washington. McDowell would then take his corps overland from Fredericksburg to join McClellan northeast of Richmond. Thus reinforced, McClellan would seize Richmond. Confederate leaders Joe Johnston, commanding the Army of Northern Virginia, and Robert E. Lee, the advisor to President Davis, divined that this was the Union intention and were keen to prevent Union forces in the valley from going to aid McClellan on the peninsula. To prevent this, the Confederates had to act. Jackson took his force west into Allegheny County. This is, say, the 1st of May. He took his force west into Highland County, which is a beautiful county, and united with a small force under Allegheny Johnson and struck a detachment of Union forces under Fremont at the town of McDowell and pushed them back about 30 miles to what is now to Franklin, West Virginia. Jackson then returned to the Shenandoah Valley with his force and Johnson's and united with General Dick Ewell's division and fell upon a small Union detachment at Front Royal, killing and capturing around 700 Federal soldiers and a considerable amount of supplies. From this position, Jackson seriously threatened Banks's position at Strasburg, so Banks hurriedly fell back to Winchester and reported as much to Washington. This is the point at which strategic panic occurred. The adopted course of action was not an effective use of military assets, it was not likely to succeed, and it would not achieve the strategic goal. I'm going to explain in detail. The messages President Lincoln sent and received and the decisions he made offer insights into his thinking. By noon on the 23rd, Banks had informed Washington that Jackson had about 15,000 to 20,000 troops, actually he had about 17,000, so it's a good estimate, and that Banks' detachment at Front Royal had been attacked and the town taken. Banks reported falling back from Strasburg to Winchester. By 1 p.m., President Lincoln was aware of a report, erroneous as it turns out, from General Geary east of the Blue Ridge, that Jackson, with 20,000 men, was advancing on Centerville, Virginia. Well, they can't be in 2 places at one time. But they didn't know that report was false, so you got to take it into consideration. Also worrisome to the Confederate authorities was the disappearance of a Confederate force south of Fredericksburg. What federal military assets were available to deal with this situation? The Union had distributed forces among several departments and districts across Maryland and Virginia. The largest group was obviously McClellan's 100,000-ish man Army of the Potomac, which was trying to seize Richmond. McClellan was just a few miles outside of Richmond waiting for the final piece of his army to join him, McDowell's 40,000-man First Corps. McDowell was by mid-May south of the Rappahannock, so he had already crossed the biggest obstacle to any forward movement. On May 23rd, Lincoln had visited McDowell and his troops at Fredericksburg. Certainly a topic of discussion was the role that the First Corps was going to play in the campaign to take Richmond. McDowell planned to start his final move toward Richmond and McClellan on May 26th. Indeed, on the 26th, McDowell had pushed his reconnaissance forces to within 25 miles of McClellan's northernmost force at Hanover. So he's 25 miles away from McClellan. And he's on the south side of the biggest river. McDowell's reconnaissance force reported to the Secretary of War that the streams in the area were all easily crossed, quote unquote, and there was no sign of the Confederates. McDowell's advance toward McClellan seemed to be free of major obstacles. McClellan would later assert that McDowell continued, if he had continued south and link up with the rest of the Army of the Potomac as scheduled, he would, quote, he would have had Richmond within a week after the junction. I'm sure that President Lincoln was like, yeah, right. McClellan was a bit slow. There were 4 other groupings of forces within an operation in relative distance. On May 24th, due to the Confederate seizure at Front Royal, Banks' 6,000-man Army of the Shenandoah was falling back on Winchester to protect its lines of communication. Fremont's Mountain Department had about 30,000 troops, but they were all over that department. So there was a mobile strike force of about 16,000 that were in the vicinity of Franklin, which is just west of Harrisonburg. Inside the substantial Washington fortifications were around 19,000 troops. 19,000, which is more than Jackson had. 32 field guns, 643 siege cannon, and 75 mortars. So there was a substantial force inside the fortifications around Washington. Some of these troops were in regiments that were imperfectly organized, and some of them were even unarmed. But there were other packets of Union troops. Geary's 2,200-man force that was along the Manassas Gap Railroad, Doubleday's small brigade at Fredericksburg, Miles's 5,000-man railroad brigade along the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and the 10,000-man federal garrison of Maryland. So there's some forces around. So what were the options? Option 1 was to order McDowell to continue towards Richmond and his scheduled link-up with McClellan. Another was to order McDowell, in whole or in part, to move north to protect Washington. A third option was to suspend the movement on Richmond and concentrate on eliminating Jackson's bothersome force. In all these courses of action, Fremont's advance on Knoxville could be suspended, and his inactive force ordered to operate against Jackson's exposed lines of communication. Ordering McDowell to move directly on Richmond promised great rewards. Because again, you take Richmond, it's possible that Confederate morale would just plummet. In Afghanistan, I was there in early days, and once the existing government gets an aura of defeat, everybody jumps ship. They're like, I'm not going down with this. And so the thinking was, maybe you take Richmond and everyone says, oh, it's over, let's just quit. Richmond was the decisive point in the Eastern Theater. McDowell and Halleck both thought so. Joe Johnston believed that to be the case. And Jackson in the lower Shenandoah was too far away from the decisive point to have any direct effect on any battle there. The Confederates, in allowing so many precious troops to go so far away from the decisive point, were taking an enormous risk, justified only by the extent which they could draw away an even greater number of Union troops. Jackson's force at Winchester, Williamsport, Harper's Ferry was around 200 miles from Richmond, while McDowell's, as I said, his lead elements were 25 miles away from the link-up with McClellan's forces. Jackson's fast, but he's not covering 200 miles before McDowell can cover 25. McDowell moving forthwith on Richmond would have turned the Confederate gamble decisively to the Union's benefit. The risk associated with this course of action was surrendering the initiative in the Valley to Jackson, who had already shown the federal leadership that this was a dangerous thing to do. In the absence of any substantial reinforcements to Banks, it would be difficult to tell what Jackson would do next. Indeed, Jackson had been told to look for the feasibility of crossing the Potomac. and some of his men believed they were going to do it. And there was some concern on the part of the President Lincoln that Jackson intended to cross the river. Between Banks's residue, Geary's small force, and Wadsworth's Washington garrison and the Maryland garrison, there were around 34,000 troops, Union troops, available to prevent the fall of Washington. That's double Jackson's force. Jackson's seizure of any other feasible objective north of the Potomac would have been annoying, but not vital. In any case, the likely federal seizure of Richmond would have been ample compensation for any damage Jackson could have done in Maryland. The second option would seem to be the least effective. Moving McDowell's 40,000 troops back to Washington to defend the capital. On the other hand, if half of McDowell's force went to Washington, the rest went toward Richmond, which is what there was some discussion of doing that. But moving 20,000 troops through enemy territory with some unknown Confederate force out there, but we don't know where, was considered risky. McDowell advised against it. The third option had its own risks and benefits. Suspending McDowell's advance on Richmond and ordering him to send a portion of his forces west to deal with Jackson would seize the initiative from Jackson, destroy his force, hopefully, and force him to return to a position from which he could not threaten Washington. This, however, was a negative goal. Denying Jackson the initiative, it would do nothing in the near term to further the positive federal goal in the Eastern Theater, which was seize Richmond. In the end, President Lincoln chose the third option. At 5:30 p.m. on the 24th of May, he ordered McDowell to suspend his movement toward Richmond. Remember, the next day was or 2 days later was when McDowell was going to head out, and send 2 of his 4 divisions west to cut off Jackson. McDowell acknowledged receipt of the order and his compliance, and then added, quote, "This is a crushing blow to us." Later that day, McDowell wrote a second letter to President Lincoln suggesting that he reconsider ordering McDowell to move west to Jackson. Quote, "The cooperation between General Fremont and myself to cut Jackson and Ewell there is not to be counted upon." Because remember, they're approaching from opposite sides of Jackson's force. They can't talk to each other. But Jackson can. He's in between. He can move forces back and forth. This is what Jomini would call interior lines. Even if it is not a practical impossibility. Next, that I am entirely beyond helping distance of General Banks. No celerity or vigor will avail so far as he is concerned. In other words, Banks, whatever's going to happen to Banks is going to happen to Banks before I get there. Next, by a glance at the map, you will be seeing that the line of retreat of the enemy's forces up the valley is shorter than mine to go against them. It will take a week or 10 days for the force to get to the valley by the route which will give us food and forage, and by that time the enemy will have retired. I shall gain nothing for you there, and I shall lose much for you here. So I think McDowell is giving Lincoln some good advice. He's like, hey boss, it's a fool's errand. Jackson's got the Valley Pike, which is a gravel road macadamized. So it's all weather. And if it rains, and it was raining a lot that spring, all the Union forces are going to go on bottomless mud Virginia roads, whereas Jackson's going to be marching on pavement or a gravel road. Lincoln opted not to follow this advice. On the morning of the 25th, the lead element of McDowell's Corps, Shields' division, left Fredericksburg for the valley. At 4 p.m. on the 24th, Lincoln ordered Fremont to suspend his campaign against Knoxville and to move southeast and seize Harrisonburg. That was probably a good call on President Lincoln's part. Along Jackson's supply line, 70 miles behind Jackson's main force. Remember what I said? Harrisonburg, Franklin. Fremont's here. This is where the Valley Pike is. So he wants Fremont to move east. And he's, 30 miles, 25 miles? So that would have put Jackson in a lot of trouble. Fremont, however, on his own initiative, decided not to move on that route as directed, but instead moved north to Moorfield, and then to attack Jackson's line of communications at Strasburg. Thus, what President Lincoln's dual-layered attack against Jackson's exposed line of communication, Fremont and Harrisonburg and Shields at Fort Royal and Strasburg, became a pincher movement aimed at Strasburg and Fort Royal only. You can't blame President Lincoln for that. Fremont just made a mistake. Worse, because of the department command structure, Fremont, Shields, and Banks would continue to operate independently with Secretary Stanton and President Lincoln doing the coordinating between them. There was no overall commander. Nowadays, the military has a thing called unified command, where you pick a geographical area and say, there's one guy in charge of that. You know, if you look at UCOM, there's one guy in charge of UCOM. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Space, whatever. If it's in Europe, one guy. They didn't do that back then. Jackson was aware of the trap and was able to slip through, due in large measure to the trifurcated Union command structure. Each Union commander knew for certain only his dispositions and not those of the other commands. This uncertainty, plus Jackson's heretofore aggressive nature, made the advance to Port Royal and Strasburg slow. Everybody knows that Jackson's hyper-aggressive, so they're moving slowly and cautiously. The Union forces were cautious and slow, and Jackson escaped. This tentative advance of three separate forces advancing towards an aggressive enemy with a central position was a foreseeable difficulty, yet it was a necessary result of Lincoln's adopted course of action. Jackson retreated, you know the rest of the story, I bet you most of you do, retreated south all the way to Port Republic, and on June 8th and 9th he used his central position to attack, and his opponent's lack of unity of command, to deliver a check to Fremont at Cross Keys and Shields at Port Republic. At the latter fight, the Union forces had finally gotten to within sight of each other. If you guys know the Battle of Port Republic, Fremont's forces got to the bluff overlooking the Shenandoah. They could shoot artillery, but they couldn't join Shields. After the defeat, the Union forces, Fremont withdrew to Harrisonburg and then to Mount Jackson, and Shields withdrew to Luray. As a postscript of the Valley Campaign, Jackson on June 18th slipped away from the Valley and joined Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in time to take part in the 7 days fighting around Richmond. McDowell's forces, however, never made it to the Army of the Potomac for the grand battle McClellan thought was coming. Jackson's diversionary campaign had stripped 40,000 Union troops from the battle, and Jackson had still been able to add his 15,000 troops to that fight. So if you were to look at the two together, it's a change of probably 55,000 troops that Jackson's Valley campaign was able to put on the Confederate balance, basically. Looking at the relevant facts of the campaign, what did the history say about the alleged panic? The enduring misconception of President Lincoln panic goes back to the immediate aftermath, and I talked to you about Tenney's books, and Davis, Allen, Webb, and Henderson. 1942, Douglas Southall Freeman, who in my view is the greatest American historian ever, wrote Lee's lieutenants. He echoed the panic theory. He wrote, "The magnitude of the panic in Washington has not been exaggerated by biographers of Jackson, but the duration of the panic and the extent which was reflected in the press have been overstated." Shelby Foote, another historian, 20th century historian, wrote, Lincoln, in terms of Lincoln's decisions, Lincoln had something more in mind than the relief of the pressure on Banks. When he sent Fremont and Shields against Jackson, he wanted to capture Jackson bag and baggage. Poring over maps of Northern Virginia, he evolved a plan whereby he would block the rebel general's retreat and crush him with overwhelming numbers. And yet, Foote wrote that the reaction was, quote, exactly as Lee had hoped and intended. So even Foote's like, good plan, but that's what Lee wanted them to do. There are two errors in citing these works as evidence of the panic. First off, the citizens of Washington may have panicked. I believe they did. There were some people that were very concerned. You look at civilian morale and the way that people acted and what journalists wrote in newspapers, and you could exaggerate things. The enemy in great force is marching on Washington, what Stanton wrote. Stanton wrote this to Northern governors. The enemy in great force are marching on Washington. Will you please organize and forward immediately all the militia and volunteer forces in your state? Well, you look at the map, you can see pretty quickly that whatever crisis was going on in Washington was going to be resolved one way or the other before the Massachusetts militia was going to get there. So that was a, Stanton being a little panicky. Lincoln was aware of Stanton's call for the militia, but he didn't sign it. Stanton issued it under his own signature. The messages that were issued over Lincoln's signature show a man who was in possession of his wits. There were, however, two exceptions. In one message sent on the evening of May 25th, remember Jackson fought Banks at Winchester May 25th, Lincoln declared that they would be, quote, utterly helpless, unquote, if McDowell had been beyond recall when Jackson attacked. Now remember what he said, there's 34,000 other troops in Maryland, D.C., and Northwestern Virginia. Another message of Lincoln's talking about the sent to McClellan on the afternoon of May 25th. Lincoln wrote to McClellan, I think the movement is a general and concerted one, such as could not be if he was acting upon the purpose of a very desperate defense of Richmond. I think the time is near when you must either attack Richmond or give up the job and come to the defense of Washington. Well, again, you look at the map, it took McClellan weeks to get the army to outside of Richmond. Getting it back to Washington was going to take a long time as well. Gary Gallagher says this shows that commander-in-chief who was trying to motivate a reluctant and hesitant subordinate. But I mean, remember, the criticism of McClellan was he was chronically slow. So you take away 40,000 troops from McClellan, do you think he's going to move faster? Well, that's implicit in what Gary Gallagher said. I don't think that's reasonable. I think if you get a cautious, you look at the messages back and forth from McClellan on the peninsula, and he's like, oh, the Confederates have got 200,000 troops. I've only got 100,000. I'm outnumbered. I'm about to get swamped. You send me more. I need more reinforcements. And you take away 40,000 more troops from that guy, and you think he's going to be more aggressive? Not a chance. Early histories of the episode have confused the timing of the alleged panic. Robert Tanner, who I think one of the best works on the Shenandoah Valley campaign was Tanner's, wrote that because Lincoln soon did fear that the Valley Army might endanger Washington, and because he unloaded that anxiety on McClellan, the traditional view of the crucial May 24th orders was that they had been motivated by fear. There was no hard evidence to support this view. Tanner distinguishes between Lincoln's orders on the afternoon of May 24th, after Jackson had seized Front Royal, but before he had seized Winchester, and Lincoln's somewhat emotional messages to McClellan on the afternoon of the 25th, when Jackson had beaten Banks again, this time in Winchester. And Banks was fleeing quickly to the rear. That's the episode that in the Civil War, the PBS movie, the Ken Burns film, where one of the officers was yelling at the Union soldier who was running north as fast as he could and says, "Don't you love your country?" And he goes, "Yes, I do, and I'm trying to get back to it as soon as I can." The president may have been momentarily concerned for the fate of Washington on the 25th, but he did not overrule decisions he had made on the 24th. It was on the 24th of May that Lincoln took the critical decision to abort Fremont's Knoxville campaign, which I said is okay, I think, and to suspend McDowell's move towards the link-up with McClellan. So Lincoln's strategic decisions on May 24th do in fact represent strategic panic. They brought about an ineffective use of military resources. There were foreseeable difficulties, like McDowell said, the roads are bad, and Jackson's got a gravel road. There were foreseeable difficulties meant that the adopted plan was not likely to succeed, and it would not achieve the strategic goal. So I'll use that measure of defining panic. I think President Lincoln panicked on May 24th. I think President Lincoln was just tired of Jackson constantly causing problems. The president diverted McDowell's critical 40,000 force from the decisive point in the theater, which was Richmond. It was an aggressive move, but the key point is this: it was an aggressive move in the wrong direction. It was an aggressive move away from success. Even if it had succeeded entirely, it would not have directly aided the seizure of Richmond. And further, there were abundant reasons to believe that chasing Jackson would be unsuccessful. McDowell had given President Lincoln some good advice on the 24th. McDowell had to cover 80 miles to reach Jackson's line of communications at Strasburg, and he told the president that getting there would take a week, which in fact it did. The Stonewall Brigade, Jackson's northernmost infantry unit, which was on Bolivar Heights, had about 50 miles to go to reach Strasbourg, and they covered that ground in 36 hours. So if you're familiar with the events of the campaign, when they got to Strasbourg, Ewell was in the lead for Jackson moving south up the valley. Said Ewell sent to the west to block Fremont, and he put some forces to try to block Shields and let the army and the trains, the wagons, the artillery, etc., get through on the Valley Pike, which worked. Each Union commander was reporting independently to Washington, and there was no overall Union commander in the field. This was an amateurish command relationship on the part of the president. Additionally, the relative isolation of each commander did not make sound military psychology. Each commander would be facing an aggressive Confederate commander possessing interior lines, one who had shown a penchant for using a central position to defeat his opponents in detail. This was not likely to produce aggressive Union commanders, and the success of Lincoln's plan depended on the aggressiveness of the commanders in the field. For these foreseeable difficulties, Lincoln's plan was a poor choice. The adopted course of action was inefficient use of assets. While two of McDowell's 4 divisions were heading west against Jackson, the other 2 were inactive. They stayed in Fredericksburg just waiting. Perhaps Lincoln realized the inefficiency himself. Once the threat to Washington appears to have passed, Lincoln then asked McDowell if he could resume his advance to Richmond. McDowell informed the president that he would need Shields and Ord's division in order to resume the advance, get his guys back. McDowell issued orders recalling Shields to Fredericksburg to resume our former operation. On the other hand, the president's plan did finally get the men of Fremont's Mountain Department into action and finally doing something. Lincoln had created the Mountain Department for 2 main reasons. Both were for domestic party politics. He wished to liberate East Tennessee. It was one of the ongoing, recurring things with President Lincoln. He was very concerned about East Tennessee. There were anti-secession, I take that back, there were pro-Union East Tennesseans in East Tennessee, and President Lincoln wanted to protect those guys. He also wanted to give Fremont a prominent command. Fremont had been his predecessor as the Republican nominee, and so he said, well, we got, Fremont can take the Mountain Department. They had largely been idle, other than the Battle of McDowell in May 10th. His men could have been quite useful in either reinforcing Banks or Washington defenses. Using Fremont's men in either of these would have helped avoid the panic that erupted from Jackson's seizure of Front Royal. Ironically, Fremont's unusual display of initiative in moving to Moorefield instead of Harrisonburg marred the one sound decision Lincoln made. If Lincoln had marched to Harrisonburg, as Lincoln had ordered him to, this alone would have forced a recall of Jackson. Remember,
Fremont's here, that's Harrisonburg. I'm sorry, Fremont's here, that's Harrisonburg. Jackson's way up here. But instead, Fremont went up to Moorefield and then against Strasburg.
a really bad mistake. At any rate, the allegations of panic on the part of President Lincoln seem unfounded, or at least unfair. Lincoln did not succumb to any kind of emotional panic on May 25th over the capture of Washington. He did, however, give in to strategic panic on May 24th, and he diverted McDowell from the strategically decisive point in the Eastern Theater, Richmond. The adopted course of action was neither oriented toward the correct objective, nor was it likely to succeed, given the vicious command relationships, and given the accepted military thought of the day. The sound advice that McDowell gave Lincoln argued for the correctness of continuing the offensive toward Richmond and the difficulties to be encountered in chasing Jackson. Yet Lincoln persisted in the air and sent his most competent and most important force on a fool's errand into the valley, in effect snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. In the end, it took the Union Army 2 full years. If you think about where the Union Army was in May of 1862, the next time they were that close to Richmond was May of 1864. It took them 2 years to get back in the positions they held in May of 1862. There's a heavy price to pay for a strategic loss of nerve. And this is, I guess, the concluding point. In May of 1862, President Lincoln had much to learn about his role as Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Armed Forces. But the episode shows he still had some learning yet to do. Thank you for your attention. I'll take some questions now, I guess. Are there any Vietnam vets in the room? No. President Johnson was known to select B-52 targets, which I'm sure the Air Force is going, and what exactly, I mean, you can do it, Mr. President, you're the boss, but what exactly is your skill set for picking targets? So when presidents try to micromanage the military, things tend to not go well. And when presidents give broad direction, establish priorities, resource the fight, and put one guy in charge, like Lincoln did eventually with Grant, then things get better. But when presidents try to micromanage, it tends to not go well. And I would hope that future presidents would read or be aware of this case and say, yeah, I need to avoid the temptation to jump in and say, okay, this is a mess, I'm going to fix it. Well, don't do that. Questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Out of the Valley campaign, what is your favorite one Jackson's battles to research and why?
Probably First Winchester. There's some great anecdotes there that came out of that one. Probably my favorite is Dick Taylor's Louisiana Brigade. He saw soldiers dodging cannonballs, and he said, "Stop that! If I catch anybody else dodging cannonballs, then I'll have you stand at attention under this fire for an hour." Okay, boss, that's a pretty stern punishment. But I think it also brings up some lessons learned on the use of cavalry. I think that a lot of Confederate commanders in the Valley, both Jackson and Early, had difficulties effectively employing their cavalry. And at First Winchester, Ashby was a great emotional, direct leader. I mean, he was able to motivate young men from the Valley to get a horse and join Ashby's cavalry, but he was not a disciplinarian. He didn't have it well organized. And if you read like Jed Hotchkiss's diary of all the times that Union forces would catch Ashby's guys drunk and napping, the cavalry was a great failure at times in the Valley. And First Winchester was one of those cases where being able to follow a defeated foe with cavalry would have really turned a defeat into a disaster. Kind of like Napoleon and Dana Auerstadt. He fought one battle in October of 1805, and their pursuit went to the Baltic Sea. I mean, the cavalry was there and in hand, and they turned a defeat for the Prussians into a disaster. But at the end of the fighting at First Winchester, Jackson looks around and says, "Where's my cavalry?" So, but at the same time, I also like. I live closer to Cross Keys, Port Republic. That's an interesting thing. Jackson was trying to be. Actually, I believe Rick's dad wrote a book about that. Where Jackson was trying to fight a delaying action to Cross Keys, then fight at Port Republic, and then go back to Cross Keys same day, which would have been quite the achievement. In the end, he said, "No, okay, 2 battles, 2 days, 2 battles. That's it." So, other questions?